Hello and welcome to Guided Notes with Mr. Weeb. Today we're looking at percents and equivalent fractions. The goal is for you to be able to say, I can figure out a percent of a number. Make sure you've got your pencil ready, your earbuds in. Don't forget to put your name and your homeroom on this, and let's get started. Okay, first, when something is 50% of 200, it means that the whole is 200. To determine 50% of 200, think of 50% as a fraction, and I think most of you do. 50% we know is half, right? 50% we know as a fraction is going to be 50 out of 100. And that is the same if we know how to make equivalent fractions. We can multiply this by 2, multiply this by 2, and so we find that that is 100 over 200. So 50% of 200 is 100. It's clear enough. And then, since 100 over 200 is 1/2, 50% is half of a whole. And maybe this number line will help you visualize what this looks like. So here we have the percents on the bottom of this number line, and the whole, in this case, is right over here. So it makes sense that between 0% and 100% would be 50%. And then between 200 and 0 would be exactly half, which would be 100 right there. Because 200 is the whole, it is positioned at 100%. So these two are linked like this. Same thing with this. At half, we have 100. So 100, we'll write down, is at 50%. So the number line shows that 50% of 200 is 100. You can also use a 10 by 10 grid to show 50% of 200. 50% of the grid is 50 squares. The whole is 200 in this case, so each square doesn't actually represent 1, it represents 2. And we should just shade the grid to 50% down here. So there's 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, and 50%. Next, let's look at how we can use equivalent fractions to figure out the percent of a number. So it says, you can also look for equivalent fractions of the number you are working with. For example, to calculate 30% of 80, you want to figure out an equivalent fraction to 30 over 100, where the second denominator is 80. And this makes sense, right? Because 30 out of 100 would be the same as something out of 80. That something is what we want to know right here. In this case, I can't divide 100 by a whole number and reach 80. So I can't do this in one step. It's going to be a two-step process. If I wanted it to be a one-step process, I could do that if the number, let's say I wanted to see what 30% of 50 was. If I wanted 30% of 50, well, I could set this up like this. 30 out of 100 is the same as something out of 50. What is that something? Well, in this case, it would be simple enough to just divide by 2, divided by 2, and I come up with 15. So I have my answer right here. That's a one-step process because I know that I can divide this by 2 and reach 50. I don't have that luxury here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my 30 over 100, and I'm going to set it up so that I end up with my second denominator as a 1. And I'll show you why in a moment. It's very simple to do this. I just divide it by 100, and I do that both to the denominator and the numerator. Finding 30 divided by 100, I don't even need a calculator for that because I can imagine that the decimal is here. Well, the decimal is here, but it's just not written down. And I move that 2 spots to the left, and I end up with 0.3 over 1. Now is when I can get the second denominator to be 80. I take that 0.3 over 1, and I'm going to set up my equivalent fraction where my second denominator is now 80. I can now multiply 1 by 80 to get to 80, and I have to do the same thing to the top. And 0.3 times 80 is 24. So my answer to the question 30% of 80 is 24. And there is my answer right there. Now I can also think of this as 30 groups of 1% of 80. Okay, so I can say 30% of 80 is the same as, well, I can write it out like this, like 1% of 80 plus another 1% of 80 plus another 1% of 80. And already I'm getting cramps in my hands because I would have to write this another 27 times. I don't have the time for that. I don't have the paper for that. So instead of doing that, I know that repeated addition is the same as multiplication. So I can say 30% of 80 is like saying 30 groups. 30% of 80 is like saying 30 groups of 1% of 80, which is the same as, and when I want 1% of 80, that's a very simple thing to do because again, I just look at my decimal right here and move it over 2 spots to the left. I need to divide by 100 essentially. So now I have 30 times 0.8, which will still get me 24, and there is my answer to 30% of 80. Note that anytime we're doing this, we're just multiplying 30 by 80 and dividing one of the numbers by 100. Anytime you want to find the percent of a number with a calculator, you can change the percent to a decimal and multiply by the number. So, for example, let's do 30% of 80 again. I can change my 30%. We know that in its decimal form, we just need to move that decimal over 2 spots to the left, and we end up with 0.3. The of becomes a multiplication sign. Of means multiply in math, and we just put that there. So 0.3 times 80 will give us 24. And there's our answer. Sometimes you need to round your answer for it to make sense. For example, suppose you know that about 1/3 of a class, or 33% of 40, is going somewhere. The number of students can't be 0.33333 times 40 equals 13.333, since you can't have a part of a person. You need to round to 13. You're not going to have just the legs of a student come along on the trip. So anyways, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.